Hello, welcome to On Air with Akin Gump. This is a special follow-up episode to a podcast that we did a few weeks ago. My name is Bob Lian. I'm a partner in the labor and employment practice at Akin Gump in Washington, D.C. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Leyden, who's a partner in our practice group in New York. And we also have a special guest today, noted epidemiologist Dr. Stephen Ostroff. A few weeks back, Lauren and I did a podcast on issues and considerations related to employer vaccine mandates. And like most things during the era of COVID, a lot has changed in just a few weeks. In fact, we learned that just yesterday, for example, the Food and Drug Administration gave final approval to the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. And we want to jump right away in today to discuss some of the emerging challenges employers are facing in their attendant legal issues involving this ongoing pandemic. As I said, we're very fortunate today to have Dr. Ostroff joining us. Dr. Ostroff has worked with our firm and a number of others on helping them understand the medical and public health issues related to the pandemic and help them shape workplace policies dealing with COVID-19. So I guess without further ado, Dr. Ostroff, can you start us off with a little bit of level setting as to where we are in the pandemic with the Delta variant that we hear a lot about these days and breakthrough infections, and what's happening now and maybe on the foreseeable horizon with COVID-19, especially now that we have the fully approved Pfizer vaccine?
Well, let me start by saying it's good to be with you, Bob. I think all of us were certainly hoping, given the availability of vaccines, which became available late last year, that we'd be in a much better position as far as the pandemic is concerned. But it looks like that's not the case. And it's all due to, I think, two factors. One of them is the variants. And of course, the variant of most concern right now, not only in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, is the Delta variant. And the second is that we haven't made nearly as much progress in getting people vaccinated as I think all of us hoped that we would have accomplished by this point in the pandemic. And that's true in other parts of the world, and it's also true in the United States. And I think we're reaping the consequences of those two issues, the variant as well as the vaccination campaigns in the United States and elsewhere in the world. So right now, we are clearly in the midst of another wave of COVID-19, this one due to the Delta variant. This is a variant that first appeared in the spring in India and caused a massive wave of infection. And since that time, it's literally spread to all parts of the world. And what we see is this version of the virus, this variant, causing problems not only in parts of Asia, including parts of Asia that have been relatively spared in the pandemic up to this point, but also in places like Australia and now New Zealand, and in certain parts of Europe as well. We are certainly seeing the impact of the Delta variant in the United States. Now, the two things that we look most closely at with variants of the virus that causes COVID-19 are two things. One of them is its degree of transmissibility. And the second is the ability of the virus to be able to evade our immune response. Our immune response either generated in response to previously being infected or our immunity developed in response to the vaccines. So looking at both of those features, one of the things that seems very, very clear and was clear even when this variant first showed up in India is that it is by far the most transmissible of any versions of the virus that causes COVID-19 that we've seen up to this point. In fact, it looks like it's about 2 times more transmissible than any of the previous variants. And so that's the primary reason that we've seen such rapid spread and why it's causing so much problems in a number of different parts of the world. As far as its ability to evade the immune response, the Delta variant is not that impressive. We've seen other variants that are able to do that much better, but they don't have the degree of transmissibility that the Delta variant has. I would say that the Delta variant is somewhere between the Beta variant, the one that first appeared in South Africa, and the original version of the virus, or the Alpha variant, the one that first appeared in the UK. So it primarily is causing difficulties because of its very high degree of transmissibility. Now, one of the other things that we've observed is that to a degree that's much, much different than what we've seen previously with COVID-19, the amount of virus that's present with people who become infected with the Delta variant is considerably higher than what we've seen with other versions of the virus. And it's likely the fact that there's more virus that grows in your respiratory tract, which makes this version of the virus so much easier to spread amongst individuals. And one of the other, I think, unfortunate aspects of the Delta variant is that the levels of virus that we see seem to not be all that much different in individuals who have been fully vaccinated with any of the vaccines, as we're seeing with individuals who have not been fully vaccinated or who are completely unvaccinated. And this is a somewhat of a different pattern. Now, one of the questions that has been asked is whether or not we see that because of the Delta variant itself, or is this because there's some evidence of waning immunity from people that had been either previously infected or people that had been previously vaccinated. And so what we're starting to see is more fully vaccinated individuals capable of picking up the virus and potentially spreading it to other individuals, although we believe that fully vaccinated individuals are not quite as contagious as people who aren't vaccinated. So we see that, and we also see some individuals developing mild illness with the Delta variant that are fully vaccinated. So these are aspects of the circumstances of the Delta variant that are really somewhat different than what we've previously seen. Right now, in the United States, there is a large amount of transmission of the Delta variant appearing all across the country. There are some suggestions that in the places that were the leading edge of this wave, such as Missouri and Arkansas, also in Nevada and Utah, that the amount of transmission and the number of cases that are being identified may have peaked out and may be starting to decline. That's kind of a hopeful sign. It's on one of the few sort of glimmers of hope related to the Delta variant. But unfortunately, in most parts of the country, we're still on the upslope of this particular wave. One of the last things that I will say about the Delta variant, which I also think is important to note, is that over the course of the pandemic, for the most part, children have been innocent bystanders when it comes to COVID. They were less likely to become infected than adults. If they did become infected, they developed very mild illness if they became ill at all. And they were much less likely than adults to spread it to other individuals. But that doesn't seem to be the case with the Delta variant. There are many more children being identified as infected with the virus. And as we have now kids returning to school at the beginning of the school year, it's becoming apparent in some locations that have already started back to school that kids in school settings are going to be a challenge, especially if there are not vigorous measures in place to reduce the spread of the virus. The bottom line, though, I think, is that most of what we're seeing with the Delta variant, especially severe disease, hospitalizations, and deaths are clearly occurring in unvaccinated individuals. And the crux of the problem right now, with what we're seeing with overwhelmed hospitals and healthcare systems, is clearly a result of us not getting enough people vaccinated.
Thank you. So I guess related to that is the question of booster shots. I mean, obviously, one needs to get vaccinated before somebody can get a booster shot. But where do you see the issue of booster shots fitting in the overall response to the Delta variant or otherwise? I mean, obviously, you want people to be vaccinated in the first instance, and that would, I would assume, certainly cut down the risk of serious illness. But where do you see the issue of booster shots fitting?
Well, I think you said it correctly, which is that clearly the most important thing is to get unvaccinated individuals vaccinated. They are, as I just mentioned, the crux of the problem in terms of the what we're seeing in terms of hospitalizations and what we're seeing in terms of deaths. And in order to really find our way ultimately out of the pandemic, we need to get as high a proportion of the population vaccinated as possible. But the other thing that we are very clearly seeing, and probably the most robust evidence, is data that's coming out of Israel. And so what you're seeing now is you're seeing not only in Israel, but in a number of other places around the world, certain countries in Europe, and now, as was announced last week in the United States, recommendations for booster doses. I don't think it's any surprise. I don't think anybody thought that you would get sustained lifelong immunity from a 2-dose series of this vaccine, especially in circumstances where nobody had prior immunity. And so I don't think it's any surprise that we're starting to see waning immunity. Nobody could quite predict what the timing would be, but I think it's clear that in order to accomplish what we want to accomplish, which is to slow down the virus, number one, and to limit the amount of severe disease that's occurring, to both, protect people and not overwhelm the healthcare system, we will need to have boosters in our future.
That was super helpful background. I really appreciate that. Laura and I are going to now pick up and talk a little bit about some of the legal issues. So thank you very much for that, Dr. Ostroff.
Glad to be with you.
We've seen with a number of our clients and even within our own law firm that the spread of the Delta variant that Dr. Ostroff mentioned and the reimposition of masking and other measures in some jurisdictions have caused businesses really to push back their office return dates. And before talking about the issues relating to booster shots, I wanted to flag a few legal issues that I think have emerged since our last podcast. I was listening this morning to a radio newscast about the full approval of the Pfizer vaccine, in which the host closed by saying that full FDA approval will lead to more employer vaccine mandates, more employee terminations, more lawsuits, and more legal clarity on employer rights in this regard. I wanted to unpack that a little bit because it was actually a pretty loaded statement that I think is worthy of some further thought. First, I don't believe that the full FDA approval of the vaccine, of the Pfizer vaccine, really has any legal effect on employer rights. As we discussed in our prior podcast, even before full approval, there was really nothing unclear in my mind about employer rights. Employers in the U.S. and virtually every state have the right to set the rules applicable to their workforce. They can direct employees to do anything that is not otherwise prohibited by statute, contract, or court-made law. There's no law that I'm aware of that says an employer cannot require employees to receive a vaccination of an approved vaccine as a condition of employment, whether that vaccine is subject to an emergency use authorization or a full authorization, provided the employer provides accommodations for employee disabilities and religious beliefs that bar them from getting a vaccine. There may be workplace policy issues. There may be employee morale reasons why employers may have wanted to wait for full approval, but there's really no legal prohibition on employers mandating a vaccine as a condition of employment. I think second, I do think it is true that there will be more employer mandates following the Pfizer full approval. Even before that full approval, we were seeing lots of reports of more employer requirements. The federal government, for example, had issued mandates for federal employees, the military, and contractors to receive a vaccination or be subject to regular testing. And in many states, localities, and school districts have issued similar requirements. So I believe in part we're going to see a marked increase in the number of employer mandates, but I don't think it's because the law or employer rights have become any more clear. Rather, I think it's because the full approval removes what may have been one of the last colorable arguments for why an employer might not wish to require employee vaccines or why employees may be objecting. I think at this point there's really a burden on employers in some respects to justify why it might not be requiring a vaccine. In fact, shortly after the FDA approval was announced, President Biden came out and encouraged private sector employers to require employee vaccinations. There's another side to this employer vaccine mandate question that's important for employers to bear in mind. I think much of the discussion has been focused on whether employers have a legal right to require vaccination, but I'm not sure enough attention has been paid, in my mind, to an employer's obligation in that regard. I'm sure that strikes some as kind of an unusual question. Does the employer actually have an obligation to require employees to be vaccinated? The Occupational Safety and Health Act and many equivalent state laws require that employers provide employees with a workplace and with work that's free from recognized hazards likely to cause death or serious injury. And I think there's little doubt at this point, as Dr. Ostroff was saying, and his reports from the past 18 months have shown, that COVID-19 is exactly that sort of hazard. While OSHA's guidance on these issues doesn't specifically require an employer to mandate a vaccine, its number one recommendation in that regard is that a vaccine is really the number one measure for mitigating that risk. If employers don't require vaccination, it strikes me that there's an added obligation for them to take steps to ensure that employees and visitors will not become sick in the workplace. So in other words, if an employer knows that the vaccine is an effective way and an accepted way to keep workers, visitors, and others safe at this point and avoid them from becoming severely ill, it strikes me that employers would seem to have invited an added burden in explaining why they're not requiring employees to be vaccinated. On the issue of employee terminations that the host of the radio show I was mentioned, while employers certainly have the right to terminate employees for not receiving a vaccine, I think it's fair to say that firing employees under these circumstances is pretty much the last thing employers want to do. From what I've seen, they're earnestly trying to do the right thing to keep employees safe, to keep productivity going, to maintain their culture in a way that many feel is being threatened by the lack of connections stemming from this ongoing remote work. But, when ongoing coaxing, cajoling, incentivizing, and pleading no longer work, I think we're going to see, unfortunately, an uptick in probably employers having to terminate employees who resist mandated vaccination. Let me pause there and turn it over to Lauren to take us through some of the issues and considerations associated with boosters. Lauren, in the context of what we talked about in our last podcast in regard to how employers can require vaccination subject to disability and religious accommodation and other emerging state and local limitations, how should employers be thinking about the issue of booster shots?
Sure. Thanks, Bob. So as Dr. Ostroff said earlier, too, we've always known that the issue of boosters would at some point come up. We just didn't know when. And so now we are in the moment that I think many people have been asking about for a while. And it naturally leads employers to ask the question, if we're requiring employees to be fully vaccinated, or we're thinking about doing that, whether to work in person or remain employed, do we then also have to require boosters? And while there's no legal requirement that says, employers, even ones that require the vaccination of their own will, that they have to then also require boosters. However, I think that most employers who come to the decision that they want to require vaccination in the first place, a lot of the factors that went into that decision likely hold for this employer, and they should also require boosters absent some change of situation, right? Significantly reduced case count or an end of the pandemic, which at this point we know, unfortunately, is likely not on the horizon right now, while we know that there will be some waning immunity, as Dr. Ostroff explained, for people who became vaccinated early on. So unfortunately, the idea of requiring boosters creates all sorts of issues that are going to be familiar to employers that have walked through this just thinking about whether or not they should require the vaccination. So how do we deal with the case of someone that's fully vaccinated but then refuses to get a booster? Can an employer terminate on that basis? As Bob was saying, most of the employers we're speaking to, it's the last thing they want to do. But then do they require that person to work from home? And I think there's some fear that that will be used by employees who simply prefer working remotely to go back to working remotely. We also still have, the difficulty of handling reasonable accommodation requests related to boosters, which is even more complicated by the fact that there could be people who have received a vaccination but don't feel that the booster is, medically necessary for them, given maybe a host of different issues they may have, and the strain on an employer in dealing with that. I think, just from an administrative standpoint, employers worry about how aggressively to track when employers need a booster. Right? Do they somehow become the person that says you're due for your booster, really taking the spot of what's mostly thought of as the medical professional? I think overall, as we've seen with the decision on whether to mandate the vaccine, a lot is going to depend on what we see the government, both local, state, and federal, do, what other companies, large employers start to do, and whether there'll be an easing of restrictions for people that receive boosters similar to the vaccination, such that there is an added incentive for employers to be able to say, please get a booster because then we won't have to wear masks indoors and things like that. But I think the one thing that we do know, like all things COVID, unfortunately, the situation remains fluid.
Thanks, Lauren. That's our update today for the on-air podcast on COVID. We will be back with you as circumstances warrant, as we have more information and more developments to share. If anybody has questions in the meantime, we'd encourage you to reach out to either Lauren or me or your counsel that you work with on these issues. But thank you very much for listening, and wish everybody well.
On Air with Akin Gump is presented by Akin Gump and cannot be copied or rebroadcast without consent. The information provided is intended for a general audience and is not legal advice or a substitute for the advice of competent counsel. Prior results do not guarantee a similar outcome. The content reflects the personal views and opinions of the participants. No attorney-client relationship is being created by this podcast, and all rights are reserved.